Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our Fall 2020 series of Coffee with the Profs. Coffee with the Profs is one of the MSU Alumni Office's long-standing featured offerings, and it highlights research and work done by some of MSU's finest faculty and staff. I'm Elizabeth Wheeler, the coordinator of the program, and I'm your host for this series. And whether this is your first time or you're a series regular, we're pleased to have you joining us. Before we get started, a little bit of housekeeping. The format for Coffee with the Profs is a 60-minute presentation by the featured professor, followed by 30 minutes of Q&A. We encourage you to submit your questions throughout the presentation, and you can do so by utilizing the Q&A icon, which is located in the tool ribbon. I'll be collecting the questions throughout the presentation, and we'll do our best to address them during the Q&A segment. Also, we are recording the presentation, and it will be available in our live stream archive on the MSU Alumni Office within 1 week. For those of you that are new to the series, prior to the pandemic and the move to virtual programming, this was an in-person event that took place on campus over the course of 4 to 6 Mondays at 10 a.m. Eastern Time in the fall, and then again in the spring. We also live stream most of our presentations. And as we look ahead to when we resume our in-person program, we'll revert back to this format with some likely tweaks. A survey should now be appearing, and we're interested to know how you plan to join us when we're back to in-person. So take a second, I should say, and answer that. That would be very helpful for us. Okay, so on to today's presentation. Our speaker is Mark Wilson, who is the professor in the School of Planning, Design, and Construction. Mark is a professor of urban and regional planning, and he also serves as the program director for the PhD in Planning, Design, and Construction. He has been on the faculty at MSU for over 30 years. His research and teaching interests address urban planning, disruptive technologies, mega events, and economic development. Current projects include the urban implications of autonomous technologies, that's a hard word, or hard phrase, mega event planning for World's Fairs and Olympics, and the role of innovation, knowledge, and information technology in urban development. Mark holds bachelor's and master's degrees from the University of Melbourne in Australia, and an AM and PhD in regional science from the University of Pennsylvania. He is the author of many articles, including a very recent one on the topic of working from home, a list of 5 lessons about working from home and the potential implications for land use and urban planning. Welcome, Mark. And with that, I'll turn it over to you for where are autonomous vehicles taking us?
Well, thank you, Elizabeth. I'm pleased to be able to join everyone. Just let me get my slides ready. So, good morning. I'm very pleased to join you today. I love the opportunity to meet with our alums, and I always find them very pleasant and enjoyable events. But with COVID, however, I think one thing that is missing is the energy of the room, of the interaction I have with our past students and current Spartans. That said, should my jokes not work out, I'm just going to assume you're laughing, and we will hope for the best, that they are actually humorous. But what I want to do today is take you on a journey, take you on a trip to where autonomous vehicles are taking us. And it is not necessarily a straightforward trip. On our journey today, we will have to back up for quite a bit. We will have detours, we will have pauses, we will encounter uncertainty. And being a dad, if we get lost, I am not going to ask anyone for directions. So I hope that you have your coffee ready. I guess my screen won't allow it, but anyway, I have coffee. I hope you do too. So buckle up and let's start talking about where autonomous vehicles will take us. So the main themes that I want to address with you today, the nature of technology, the nature of mobility, what autonomous vehicles are, a word about words, and also some of the dreams and nightmares that I have as an urban planner when it comes to thinking about what our future might be like. So first, I think it's important to realize that we do, as a society, have a relationship with technology. One of my concerns is that often technology is seen as something that happens from without, that it is handed on down from on high, that somehow we are disconnected from it, that we embrace it. It is the next new thing. And I think that's a concern because technology is something that our society produces. We make decisions, the owners of technology make decisions, regulators make decisions about technology. So it's not accidental that we have the technology we have today. It's not an accident that Apple doesn't put headphone jacks into its products anymore. That is a decision that is made. It is not the technology itself deciding that. It is, in fact, some of the many forces at work that are shaping the technology we have. My call today, in fact, will be for us not to give up control, not to sit aside and blindly accept all the new technologies that come our way. Many of them are great and many I support, but at the same time, we need to have that critical conversation about what this technology is going to do for us as individuals and as communities. One of the problems that we have with the introduction of new technology is that it happens faster than we can understand it. And that is what we faced with autonomous vehicles, but it's what we also faced with the internet. That the scientists working on the technology often have been working on it for decades. And they're there trying to perfect it. And I have great trust in our scientific community to make the right decisions, to think about making products that are safe and helpful. What is much less predictable is how will people accept it? The social side of new technology is far messier and complicated than the technical engineering side. Engineers can predict how long it will take until a new development is likely to be feasible or workable. But I find it very hard to predict when a community will accept an autonomous vehicle, when it will accept a new way of accepting mobility. That is much messier and complex. So what tends to happen with all technologies is the people trying to get it work have been doing it for a long time. They have a very sophisticated understanding, they have their own language, and then it gets near readiness and is revealed to the public. And the public is not ready, it has to come to terms with it. Social scientists have to come to terms with it. Engineers have been planning autonomous vehicles for decades, but social scientists have only really been looking at this for the last 5 years. And we are dealing with the very messy implementation end of a technology. To give you an example, we have a team of scholars at MSU, and some of my colleagues and I did a study of the literature on autonomous vehicles. And we found 100,000 articles on engineering an autonomous vehicle. And we found 189 articles on how to build cities for autonomous vehicles. And so very clearly there's an imbalance. So I almost feel like on the social and regulatory side of any new technology, we're running and we're chasing to catch up with what the technology is and can do. And the reason this is so important is because it's disruptive. It disrupts our life. And we need to be able to trace through those disruptions. But it's very hard to do so. The timeline is often uncertain. The groups that will benefit and those that will pay a price may not be obvious from the very beginning. So we can tell you that there will be disruption ahead, but not clearly in which direction, because there are many scenarios. And at each stage on the rollout of a new technology, there are forces that could change the trajectory of that technology and take us somewhere new or different. To give you an example that we can be familiar with at the moment, And this is looking at new technologies, in particular, how they affect cities. On the left, you'll see Rolling Acres Mall in Akron, which had less than 25 years of life as a mall before it was abandoned and vacated. And we're seeing a lot of these issues at the moment when shopping centers, shopping malls have lost their purpose because we have online commerce to take its place. These were predicted. In the early 90s, I wrote an article, The Fall of the Mall, predicting that the mall will in fact lose its role. But it took 30 years for that to come about and has only been accelerated by COVID. We have the use of smartphones, which can be a great benefit, but also a great annoyance. If you don't have one, it can be difficult because you're expected to have one. And so you can't fulfill transactions because you don't have the technology that vendors now may well demand. But we have changes in the way we interact with people. I remember when I made plans as a youth and you had to stick to your plans because there was no way of reaching the other parties. Whereas today we have almost unlimited flexibility when it comes to contacting and communicating with people. And what you can see in the lower level is MSU is a true innovator in renewable energy. And what you see here is the old power station and the new solar arrays that are going up on the parking lots in South Campus. These are all disruptions. In fact, it's a perfect storm of disruption that the autonomous vehicle is merely adding to, because all of these changes will affect how we live. It may affect how we work, it may affect where we live. Now, when we think about technology, it takes a fair amount of trust because it's not a technology we can fully understand anymore. We can't open the hood and look in a car and determine what's wrong with it. We have to have someone plug a computer into it to tell us what's going on. We also rely a lot on algorithms to tell us what movies we may like, what books we may prefer, how to run our automated systems. And all of that involves a certain amount of trust that the technology will do what it is supposed to do. And on one level of trust, it is that the bugs have been removed. But we also have another issue of trust, and that is that the algorithms that are running these new systems are in fact appropriate and representative. And that is a concern at the moment because so many of these new systems are essentially black boxes to the public. We know that something is being done, but we don't necessarily know how. And one of the more concerning issues is a term called algorithmic bias. And that is algorithms have been found to be based on poor sets of information, and therefore they do not work successfully. So recently there has been a lot of concern about face recognition software, which is done by airlines to theoretically make it easier for us to get on a plane. It is done for safety, for policing. But the tests of the algorithms has found that face recognition software has tended to focus on identifying Caucasians, and it has a very low success rate for African Americans and Asian Americans. And therefore, the potential for error is far greater. So if we're going to trust these systems, we're going to need to know what makes them work. And so if we get into an autonomous vehicle, how much can we trust what it will do? And I think perhaps the most famous example from the film 2001 is Dave's ongoing battle with Hal, the onboard computer, that at some stage decides it knows better than Dave what has to be done and tells Dave, I'm sorry, I'm afraid I can't do that. This is a nightmare. I hope that we don't have to face this, but it's something we have to be mindful of, because if we can't see what's happening inside, we have to trust someone, somebody, some organization, that the technologies that are being delivered to us will in fact be fair and equitable and work as we have been led to believe. Now, I want to take a slight detour to the world of shoes as we talk about technology, to give you an example of some of the issues that arise. And so I'm a great devotee of urban history, the history of cities, and I teach a class at MSU on urban history. And one of the lessons from urban history is that as people moved from villages and farms to settlements, they started building up settlements, they started using stone, building roads, and eventually sidewalks, which were an afterthought. And in doing that, what people wore on their feet had to change, which meant that you could have been happy with straw wrapped around your feet or with a piece of leather wrapped around your street, and that would have been sufficient for much of the work you did. But if you move to a city and you suddenly have to start moving around a city, going in barefoot is not comfortable. And a thin piece of leather between you and cobblestones and the pavement is not particularly comfortable. And so we have to start inventing a technology, and we start creating shoes. And shoes became more elaborate. There's some evidence that the way people walk over time has changed because of the footwear that we have. And the end result is we created cities, and yet we have this unanticipated impact of needing shoes and possibly walking differently. All because the fact that we wanted a built urban environment that was long lasting. So we replaced the earth, we replaced the grass with pavement and stone. So unintended consequences are also going to be an issue as we move forward. And there is also a predictable consequence that relates to the shoe you see before you. And this dates to the Industrial Revolution of the late 1600s and through the 1700s, as new technologies came about. And so you may have been a weaver in your cottage. You got up when you wanted to, you finished when you wanted to. You may have spent months on making a piece of cloth that was very expensive. And the Industrial Revolution recognized the opportunity of water and steam-powered textile mills. And so the large-scale production of cloth became common. The public was very happy because suddenly an expensive item was now much more affordable. But the people who made that cloth lost their livelihood, and they had to work in a factory. And someone told them when to start and when to finish and when to take a break and when they could go to the bathroom. And if something happened, they would lose their job. There was no safety net. It was a very different time. And so there was a lot of resentment of technology around the Industrial Revolution. And among the more radical reactions were the Luddites. But another one that I find particularly interesting linguistically is the use of wooden shoes. And this shoe is sabot, which was commonly worn in northern France and southern Belgium today. And the disenfranchised textile workers, the weavers who were forced to work in factories, used their shoes to damage the machinery. And they would kick their sabots into the machinery to ruin them as a protest against what the new technology was doing. And of course, that is where we get the current word sabotage from, of kicking one's wooden shoe into a piece of machinery to damage it. But we have to remember that as we introduce new technologies, there will be people who will not like it, who will be perhaps harmed by that new technology. And we must be mindful of the protest that not everyone wants to embrace the new, simply because it's new. So what I want to do now is to talk about the concept of mobility and our ability to move around. Our ability to move changes how and where we live. But in order for us to think about how we will live in the future with autonomous vehicles, I think it's important to back up, to go into reverse for a while, and look at how mobility has affected cities in the past, because that's the only way we can really get a sense of some of the main features of what a future with a new mobility technology will be like. So let's put ourselves in London in 1560. It was one of the world's largest cities at the time, but still, by today's standards, it was essentially smaller than East Lansing. And to get around London, you only had a few choices. You are likely to have walked, to have used the river, and you can see here the amount of traffic on the river. If you were affluent, you may have had a carriage. If you were moving goods to the market for sale, you may have had an oxen or a horse draw that load to the marketplace. But what you can see in the design of the city is that it is designed for the mobility available to it. And this will be a theme that will run throughout my presentation this morning. And that is, mobility forms create different urban forms. So what we have here is a medieval city that is designed for medieval technology. The streets grew organically, haphazardly. They were only wide enough to take a cart or some horses or foot traffic. They could have been narrow lanes. And so the city grew based upon the mindset of the time. We build cities and extend cities based upon the type of mobility technology we have. But transportation is fundamental to urban form. And as the transportation systems have changed through history, so have the shapes and scales of our cities. So clearly, walking around a city is not particularly productive, and we would seek much more efficient ways of moving around. And one of these was the horse-drawn tram in North America. And this involves making sure the streets are paved, laying down rails, having stables of horses to pull these trams through the city. But as you can imagine, you can go a lot further on a tram than you can on foot, which made it possible for some people to live further out, to have a more comfortable trip into the town when they needed to. And so it was very liberating. It made cities larger. It grew the cities along the pathways of the trams. But there were also problems with this new technology. One is that the downtown streets had to be somehow fitted and contorted to make sure that the tramways could go through. And tramways generated a huge amount of waste, both in terms of the manure that accumulated and also with the fact that if you have thousands of horses pulling trams in a major city, that there are going to be the deaths of horses in the street on a regular basis, many a day in many large cities. And so this new transportation system brings us mobility, but you have to pay for it, whereas walking is free. It also brought a huge waste disposal problem, and it changed the way cities looked. So not surprisingly, when something better came along, it was a popular choice. And that better was the engine, in this case, an electric engine. And many cities that we may not have thought of today as having transit systems like this did in fact have them. And here we have a picture of Grand Rapids in 1926, a dense downtown that would have arms that would stretch out into the countryside, where these trams would take people to their houses, where people would use them to get to and from work. But whenever we get a new technology, we have to retrofit it into the previous footprint. And as you can see here from this example in Lisbon, trying to fit trams into a medieval city is not the easiest thing to do. And these trams have been around for a century. But retrofitting the city requires a lot of changes be made. And so when we change our transportation mode, we have to change our city. And that's not always the easiest thing to do. Now, with trams and streetcars, you still have the problem of having to stick to its schedule and going where the streetcar goes. And that's not always convenient. And so as we have the evolution of the internal combustion engine and the car, the automobile, we have a liberation of the population. And cities, instead of looking like stars that were growing out along the transit lines or the subway line, the city could now fill in because people had the ability of going where they want to. And this is a wonderful image of Wilshire Boulevard in Los Angeles. It rarely looks like that today, mainly because of the congestion. But this was a time when driving was growing in popularity. Driving was still recreational. So roads were often designed for the recreational pleasure of driving with curves and views, rather than the quick commute that we expect today. And of course, they expanded cities even more. If you had the money for a car, you could then move out even further, or you could move to land that didn't have public transit and build a house or live there. And so we have a different type of city forming now. And this is a city that doesn't depend upon a backbone of a public transit system, but in fact starts to depend on an individual owning an automobile. And what's interesting about private transportation, whether it's a bicycle, a car, or an autonomous vehicle, is that the individual's desire to purchase this technology also requires that society meet that need and provide the infrastructure for it. So if enough people buy vehicles, then the state, the city, has to start paying for the infrastructure that is necessary to cater to that individual purpose. So whenever we have a change in transportation technology, we also have an imposed responsibility on our cities and society to meet that. And often we meet that demand uncritically and provide what is wanted. Now, as we enter the 1930s, it's a time of great distress, the Great Depression. People are under high rates of unemployment. The cities are congested, they're polluted. The desire of living in a green, verdant neighborhood is very appealing. But that's not likely to happen because at a period when there's very little employment, people are on low incomes, it's not likely that they will be able to achieve that goal. But it exists as a dream. And I think the greatest manifestation of that dream was Futurama. And Futurama was General Motors' exhibit at the 1939 World's Fair in New York. And Futurama was the most popular attraction at the World's Fair. And people would stand in line all day to experience it. And what General Motors did to an audience that was coming from congested and polluted cities was to offer them a vision of what their life could be like. And it was incredibly popular. It was an expensive pavilion. It innovated many of the technologies that were later adopted by theme parks. And you entered this vision of the future and you exited on a freeway interchange that General Motors had created in the World's Fair. And you received a button that said, "I have seen the future." So you would sit in moving cubicles that each had synchronized sound, an amazing innovation at the time, and you saw a gigantic model of the city of the future. And these were, in fact, the magic motorways of the future. And what you can see is, in some ways, what we got. Places designed around freeways with nodes of high-rise buildings. Ironically, you don't see a person in this display, or really need to consider where do people live, where do they work, and what happens when there's not enough traffic, not enough road space for the traffic that is generated. but it left an indelible mark on the public. It showed us where the auto industry wanted us to go, and it provided this vision of a city surrounded by the perfect suburb. And these perfect suburbs were an incredibly appealing ideal. They were spacious, they were new, the housing technology was new. You may have left a stuffy, cramped apartment to go out into the suburbs and live what was seen as the dream of the time. And so this move out to the suburbs was facilitated by the automobile, because with lower density living, public transit is rarely successful. And so you have to rely on private transport in order to get around. So once again, cities are recreated. They are hollowed out. People move to the suburbs. We rely upon roads more than public transit. And we invest the money necessary to create the infrastructure for private transportation. But buried within this idea of the perfect suburb was also the opportunity this technology brought for discrimination. Because whenever a new technology emerges, it can be used to help, but it also can be used to suppress, to exclude. And the suburbs were no exception. The suburbs allowed segregation in the United States, and through the land use, mortgage, redlining, we institutionalized racism into the expansion of our city. And the cities we have experienced to this day have all the footprints of that early expansion in the 40s and 50s. And as we expanded into the cities, as we adopted this new technology, we had to change the world around us to cater to it. And so we had to create, promote, invent the gas station, new ways of dining where we drove, ate, and drove back. No longer the walking to the neighborhood restaurant, but the driving to the neighborhood drive-in restaurant. That our entertainment came as facilitated by the automobile. And shopping moved out to where we lived, further reinforcing this decentralized urban form that was dependent upon the automobile for progress. Now, as we experience what this new technology can liberate, and those that were able to, could afford, or were allowed to own property in the suburbs, it fostered a huge change in how people moved. And that meant that we're retrofitting the city once again. And part of that retrofitting in the 50s was that people weren't using streetcars. They were considered inflexible. And so we here moved from a Detroit electric streetcar that was being replaced by buses on Woodward Avenue. Buses are more flexible. They can take different routes at different times of the day. They can serve different areas. They don't have the infrastructure cost. They have greater flexibility. And by getting rid of the streetcars, however, we got rid of the corridors that promoted some community and density in our urban areas. And one of the outcomes of the automobile supplanting the streetcar was that we scrapped streetcars. Los Angeles is famous. If you like Roger Rabbit, you'll know the full story, for having an extensive streetcar network that was scrapped to be replaced by automobiles. Ironically, Los Angeles is now one of the major light rail cities of the United States with extensive underground and light rail transit systems. So we are changing and retrofitting the city to fit the new technology. It's a very Procrustean argument that we will re-bend the city into a form that allows the current technology to work better. And so this is where we ended the 50s in Detroit. What you can see here is a traditional neighborhood. It had pluses and negatives. The pluses would be that it had community, that you could walk to get many of the things you needed, if you needed food or to go shopping or to eat or even to work. You could get there by walking or using a streetcar. The trouble is, this was also higher density. The structures were somewhat old. The condition was not always current. And so there was always the allure of moving somewhere else. But you would be giving up a walkable community where you may have known everyone on your block. And this is what it was replaced with. This is the same area 2 years later after the Chrysler Freeway was built. And so the perhaps most brutal remaking of cities for transportation was the demolition of many neighborhoods. And usually these were neighborhoods with the weakest voice. These were the neighborhoods in particular of African-American communities, often quite vibrant and alive, yet targeted to make space for this new form of transportation. And suddenly by building this new transportation system, which was incredibly efficient. If you had a car, it was wonderful if you were trucking things. But if you were walking or you wanted to see your neighbors, it was very different. And it further encouraged outward movement of our cities to a different area. We have a very stark example of this with 496 through Lansing. That relatively short freeway, in fact, demolished a number of thriving African-American neighborhoods in Lansing. And in fact, there are a number of displays in town at the moment commemorating the anniversary of the building of 496 and how it really did demolish a lot of the communities of Lansing at the time. And to this day, it is very clear as you drive along that road, you can see the housing on each side that at one point would have been part of a core neighborhood that now no longer exists. So having gone backwards for the last half hour, I now wish to take us forwards and to talk about autonomous vehicles. And the reason we've spent so much time going backwards was really to get a sense of the scale of impact that a change in technology can have on the built environment. And in particular, how a change in transportation can affect cities and how they're organized. So autonomous vehicles come at 6 different levels of autonomy. And they start out with having no automation at all. And very few vehicles today have no automation, because you at least have cruise control and you may have many other things as well. And we're moving to 2s and 3s now, and the ultimate goal is to be level 5. And at level 5, we don't have to do anything. At levels 0, 1, and 2, where our hands are on the wheel and we're pretty much taking control of a lot of the functions. 3 and 4 is a particularly messy stage in the evolution of autonomous vehicles because the driver is necessary. The driver is expected to have their hands on the wheel or within a split second be able to take control of the vehicle. And that ability to jump in at the last minute is proving highly problematic. And so rather than having this orderly sequencing in our society through all of these levels, I can see a skip of 3 and 4 completely, simply because the insurance implications of who, in fact, was in charge of the vehicle when something happened is highly controversial and is likely to mire the legal system in many difficult cases. And we already are having difficulty trying to determine responsibility of accidents when someone is on autopilot or is relying upon some element of technology to do the work for them. So what exactly do autonomous vehicles bring us? Well, they're really an accumulation of technologies over the past 50 years. And we have experienced many of these. As I said, we have things like cruise control, collision avoidance, automatic braking. We can have the vehicle off. And so there's lots of things that vehicles have been doing. And we're building up to a vehicle that can do all of this with a destination that we have placed into it. Now, one of the distinctions to make is that strictly, autonomous vehicles only refers to a vehicle that can find its way around. And you can see the MSU autonomous vehicle at times going around campus. When we, as the public, think of autonomous vehicles, we're thinking of connected autonomous vehicles, CAV. And this is when the vehicle is connected to the infrastructure, to the cars ahead, to traffic reports that give it an entirely new level of ability because it knows what to anticipate ahead and can change route or tactics or speed accordingly. But autonomous vehicles are going to bring a lot of advantages. And so you will hear me being critical today about autonomous vehicles. And I do that as a friend of the technology who is concerned that these new forms of transportation benefit everyone. So some of the benefits are safety. 40,000 highway deaths, 7,000 pedestrian deaths a year, many of which can be avoided. We remove the issue of drink driving from calculus in an autonomous vehicle. We are bringing access for many, a challenge that is likely to affect us and may be affecting our parents and grandparents now is that if they're living in the suburbs and don't have the ability to drive, they become very quickly isolated because there's nowhere they can walk to. They can't walk to the corner store. They can't walk possibly to a park. There is very little that they can get to on their own mobility. And if they have mobility challenges, then it's even greater. So access to the old, to the young, to people with disabilities would be liberating. Because they communicate with the infrastructure and themselves, we're going to have better traffic management and flow and less pollution. That as autonomous vehicles tend to be electric and we shift to electric vehicles, and if those vehicles use renewable energy, then we're likely to see a significant environmental impact because we're not using the internal combustion engine. And COVID has shown us many cities around the world that have views and vistas that haven't been seen in 50 years because of the auto pollution that has not existed under lockdown. We'll also have new industries that will provide economic opportunity, employment, and certainly in a state like Michigan, we are hoping that we can continue to be the leader in automotive technology. But there's also a cost to these autonomous vehicles. We're going to have to redesign cities. I think there's more positives than negatives in the redesign, but we still will have to spend money redesigning. We have the potential for sprawl because people are sitting back, relaxing, watching Netflix, answering email. They're not driving, so they may be much happier to live further away from their meeting or their work than normal because they don't have the hassle of traffic as a brake on their willingness to be mobile. We will potentially see employment loss because some industries may go away. And one of the challenges at the moment is that the autonomous vehicle is a partnership between Detroit and San Francisco. It is a combination of the traditional automobile with software. And another concern is that social exclusion. If new technology can be used to exclude some and include others, it will. So to give you an example of what an intersection might look like, this you will see is a familiar intersection we have today where you reach an intersection, and everyone knows Grand River and Hagedorn is a perfect example of this, although that intersection is far slower than this one. But you can see that there are pulses of traffic moving through, and there's pausing, there's idling that takes place. But if you look at an autonomous system where there is constant interaction between vehicles, then that pulsing is not so nearly necessary because the vehicles can weave themselves through. So on one hand, I love the simulation. It's actually a game you can buy. Um, but there's also fear, because put yourself in one of these vehicles and how would you feel? And this is where we go back to trust. If you trust it, you can sit there and relax and drink your coffee and read your email, then it may not bother you. But if you're sitting there in the passenger seat without a driver and you're going through an intersection like this, then it may produce a lot of anxiety in you. So again, these are some of the social issues we need to recognize as we think about what the new technology would be like. Another social issue is that autonomous vehicles have a set speed limit. And anyone who has driven the interstate in Michigan knows that people don't like to drive the speed limit. And so imagine yourself when you're driving down to Ann Arbor or to Metro Detroit Airport, and you're stuck on 70 because that's all the car will allow you to do. It's very different from what you often witness on the interstate today. What happens if there's half a dozen vehicles in front of you doing the speed limit because they're autonomous? What do you do as a human driver in those circumstances? We have a lot to learn about ourselves before we can fully implement these new technologies. So what we have to do as communities is to think about how we will come to terms with it. We need to make decisions. But to do that, there are a lot of gaps. How will the public perceive them? How will they affect our mobility? What decisions will communities make to influence how autonomous vehicles are used? When early automobiles came out, some required that you walk in front with a flag. Another community required you to disassemble the vehicle and cover it with a green tarpaulin so as not to scare horses. What will our communities decide to do when autonomous vehicles become common? So, hyperbole beside, we need to know. And there are surprisingly few surveys of what the public thinks. And this is because the public really doesn't know a lot about autonomous vehicles yet. So a couple of years ago, we surveyed 1,000 Michigan residents to find out what they thought about autonomous vehicles. Because until we know what the public feels, it's very hard to plan for them. So some of the reactions were that it would be chaos. They'd be terrible, ridiculous, they're not trusted, they're junk, waste of money, scary robots, crazy. So there is a sizable population in Michigan that doesn't have a positive first impression of autonomous vehicles. And then you have another group that is predisposed to these technologies. They think they're cool, they're amazing, they can't wait for pizza delivery, they're interesting, self-parking, they're good for the environment. They represent freedom. So we have a group that is looking forward to these technologies. And for some reason, pizza always gets mentioned in Michigan. And so the idea of autonomous pizza delivery has not been lost on the main providers of pizza in our communities, who think about what autonomous systems might allow when it comes to getting food delivered to home. We also have a group that don't know about the technology, not heard of them, nothing comes to mind, they have no idea. So we have quite a few different reactions in our survey. And what we did in our survey is to ask half what they thought about self-driving vehicles and half what they thought about autonomous. And you'll see here that words matter, and I have a special section on words in a few more slides. So when we use self-driving, 47% of respondents responded with a concern, compared to 24% of respondents who were concerned about autonomous. On the other hand, autonomous prompted thoughts of technology more than it did for self-driving. Benefits were about the same. Self-driving cars prompted responses like Tesla or GM or Google, brand names. And then we have a group that recognized that autonomous meant driverless. So what were the concerns? Clearly, the word self-driving prompted more concern than autonomous. Generally, concerns were greater if people were over 40 years of old, 40 years of age. Autonomous was a concern for older age groups more than the term self-driving. Interestingly, it didn't matter how much money you made, whether you lived in rural or urban areas. Across these variables, the response was fairly consistent. What we did find is that increasing education is associated with a more positive view of autonomous vehicles. We followed up with another survey last year at MSU, because MSU is essentially a small town and city, and in fact, the road area of MSU makes it equivalent to many small cities, and it makes a perfect test bed. So we surveyed the faculty, staff, and students at MSU to find out what they thought. And about half the population, which would skew highly educated, was familiar with the concept. 40% were positive about them, 37% neutral, and 23% negative. So very clearly a broad spread with an unsure center that will slowly move towards a position as greater experience concerned. We asked our population what they would think if they were a passenger in an AV. And safety was almost a third, lack of driver control, conflicts with other road users, and only 10% of our population of over 3,000 was unconcerned about anything as a passenger in an AV. We then asked MSU how would they feel sharing the environment with an AV. So 31% would feel safe as a pedestrian, but then we have 2/3 that would not necessarily feel safe. 18% would feel safe as a cyclist, and 34% would feel safe driving a vehicle on a road with another AV. So very clearly, even an effective, perfect AV is going to elicit a range of responses in the public. Yet these are the responses we have to take into account, because it's no good creating a new technology if a lot of people are opposed to it and don't wish to use it. So I want to take a brief pause here to make an advertisement for MSU and its role. It's a chance to top up your coffee if you haven't already. And I want to talk about socio-mobility. One of the things that we recognized at MSU is that the engineers and the social scientists and the many other fields at MSU weren't communicating with each other about what was happening. Engineering was unaware of what we were thinking about in the social sciences and urban planning, and we were unaware of exactly what the state of the art was in autonomous vehicles in terms of what they could do. And so a couple of years ago, we held a national conference on campus, and we coined the term socio-mobility. And this is to recognize the social implications of the different mobilities we use. And in stating this, we recognize that mobility is not simply the vehicle. It is the bicycle, the skateboard, it is walking, it is the scooter, it is lots of things. And so we recognize that as technology changes, we needed to be mindful. And so we brought together all of the folks on campus with an interest in the social engineering interaction. And we have over 70 faculty we have identified on campus already who are aware, mindful, and eager to look at the implementation of these technologies and how they might affect people. So now I want to pause to talk about words for a minute. Whenever a new technology evolves, it brings a lexicon with it. And that means we have to learn a new language. We learned a new language in the 80s when we learned about lasers and Ethernet and GUIs and mice. And so we learned a new language about how to deal with the technology. And this is something we will have to do once again. We did it with the automobile in the 1890s. There was a lot of debate about what to call the automobile. Terms like benzene buggy the horseless carriage, the automobile. In 1899, the New York Times wrote a scathing editorial attacking the words applied to this new technology. They were appalled at the concept of horseless carriage, and they were appalled at automobile because it was half Greek and half Latin, and it was, in their words, an abomination. We created new words when cars came around. We had to create and criminalize crossing the street. And so the word and concept of jaywalking evolved. As pedestrians who had controlled the street started to cede that territory to the automobile as it became increasingly popular. A group of colleagues and I in urban planning analyzed the semantics of the language associated with autonomous vehicles. And we discovered that 4 words are commonly used: automated, autonomous, driverless, and self-driving. And in the use of those words, however, they were used interchangeably. Yet, if you speak to experts in the field, they all have subtle differences in meaning. And they will have subtle differences when they come into the language of the law, into regulations. And so the word choice matters. We've also seen a shift away from autonomous, which reminds us of Hal persecuting Dave in 2001, to automated, because the term is more of a helpmate rather than a crazy robot. But what we also noticed in the language of autonomous vehicles was an inevitability, that they were spoken of as being inevitable. And that may be the case, but it troubles me because we're talking about something being inevitable before, as a society, we've had a conversation about how we want it to work. So what are the implications for cities of these issues? Well, we need to understand what the public thinks. Are we willing to go from an owned vehicle to a shared autonomous vehicle? How much road space will be left? What happens to parking, garages? Do we need signs if everything is autonomous? What happens to our houses? Who pays for the roads? And this is all being accelerated by COVID-19. As we shift to work from home and deliveries, we've already changed the city. And how much of COVID-19's change behavior sticks has yet to be determined. So in my last section, I want to talk about some dreams and nightmares that we can expect going into the future. And so another detour to Erwin Schrödinger, the Nobel Prize-winning physicist, who's famous for the thought experiment of locking a cat in a box with a poison vial. And you don't know whether the cat has damaged the vial and been killed or whether it's alive. So Schrödinger's experiment, I see having applicability to thinking about the future of the city. Because if we lock down a city with autonomous vehicles, at the moment, we can be incredibly positive or incredibly negative. But I can't tell you what. I can tell you that the city is going to be both positive and negative, utopian and dystopian going into the future. But I can't tell you which direction it will go because we haven't really got enough information or tested out the concepts enough. So we are essentially looking at utopian versus dystopian future. And of course, my utopia could well be your dystopia. So to be positive, let's think a little bit about some of the dreams we can have, some of the things that planners would like to see happen. On the positive side, that the autonomous vehicle does not kill us or poison us as we look inside the box in decades to come. Some of the dreams I have, of course, is greater mobility for all, more people being able to move around as they need. I look to greater efficiency and sustainability, to environmental gains, to things like ride sharing with fewer trips, all those parking spaces being reused, smaller housing footprints, so our suburbs take up less space. We use this as an opportunity to increase density. Or we use it as a rationale to have a discussion with our neighbors about how we would like our future to look. So we may not need as many streets as we had before. We can have wider sidewalks, places to walk. We can have cycle paths that may make people more active. Again, we can rethink what our city landscape looks like. These are estimates of what New York City looks like or could look like in an autonomous future. We can take parking garages and turn them into apartments or into office blocks. And we can think of creative ways of dealing with the mall, because what happens when the mall falls? And this is, in fact, a current project underway, the White Flint redevelopment in the suburbs of Washington, because malls are already failing. 20% of malls were predicted to fail in the next 5 years before COVID accelerated home delivery. And so this was a classic mall with anchor department stores that is being reimagined as a small city. It has apartments, it's highly walkable, there are offices, there are restaurants, entertainment, stores, commercial activities. And so we're replacing the mall with something different. And I would love to reimagine many of the somewhat desolate malls we have around us today being turned into something positive. And as we reuse the mall for living, then we take pressure off taking over farmland and green fields. But what happens to us at home? What happens if we walk out in the morning and summon an autonomous vehicle and ride share into the office? What happens to the space? Look at the traditional suburban home. Look at how much of the frontage is devoted to parking. So we've got rid of our vehicles. What do we do? Well, this is clearly what many garages already look like. So we've already experienced what the future might be. But it doesn't have to be that way either. We will have this space. What do we do with this space? Now, clearly, there are some great things you can do with your space. The potential for she sheds and man caves is really considerable. And think of what you might do with 300, 400, 500 square feet of extra space in your house. And so now you can start your spouse thinking about how you can imagine it without the vehicles and what you want it to look like. And up until that point, I think everyone's very happy. But what if your neighbors start turning their 500 square foot garage into an apartment, or putting it on Airbnb, or seeking greater potential to rent out, of bringing in an extra family? Anyone who's ever engaged with a local planning committee knows that such changes do not come easily or conveniently or even pleasantly. But there are also nightmares, the things that keep us awake at night when we think about what our future might look like with autonomous vehicles. And some of those nightmares might be that we have empty autonomous vehicles roaming around, the zero passenger trip. That people have an autonomous vehicle and it takes them from home to work and the vehicle comes home and then it comes in to get them later. That people are living further away because they can sprawl. That public transit is challenged, that some groups are marginalized and disconnected from their community, that an autonomous vehicle generates terabits of data a day per vehicle, that tracks our every move. But another nightmare is that this is an opportunity we didn't have to talk about the automobile. And so it's another opportunity for us to talk about our future. So what is a nightmare? Well, thinking about downtown Lansing, which was the 2018 Crater City Award winner, that is the city that has the most surface parking lots. These are used for 8 hours a day, vast amounts of space. I would love to see them reused into mixed residential commercial applications, but what if they're not? What if they're just left there and we start to see weeds growing in them the way we do with some strip malls at the moment? What about all of the parking ramps, parking garages we have? What happens to them? They're very awkward to retrofit because they have so many inclines in them. This is not too bad. It at least has a flat floor, but inclines are difficult to retrofit. What about public transit? Autonomous vehicles are likely to eat away at public transit. And this is already happening. The trouble is public transit, especially subways, are particularly efficient ways of moving people around. Yet if we lose riders to autonomous vehicles because of their convenience, then what happens to these awesome mass transit systems that we've created in our cities if not enough people use them? And what happens to walking? We've already seen that ride hailing, that Uber and Lyft, is a disincentive for people to walk. In the past, if you were out late on Saturday night, the only way home was an expensive cab or you walked. But now you and your friends get an Uber, you Venmo each other a couple of bucks, and you're done. You've saved yourself 1.5 miles of exercise, but you also haven't done your health much good in the process. So what happens to our health as a result of this shift away towards autonomous vehicles? What happens if our roads are just filled with autonomous vehicles like they're filled with vehicles as they are today? And to finish this section on hyperbole, what if the cars run amok, like in Fast and Furious 8? So what I can say is that we have a lot of tough decisions ahead of us, that we really have to think about what our cities are going to be like, about the decisions to be made. Jane Jacobs, who railed against the freeway, who protested Robert Moses' attempt to bulldoze Lower Manhattan. So Greenwich Village, Tribeca, Soho, all of those neighborhoods were slated for demolition. And Jane Jacobs called out and started a movement to recognize that being on the street, being in a community is important. And as she states in this quote, that our cities only work when everybody is consulted and everyone benefits from the city. So to give a final plug before we open up the questions, I'm from the School of Planning, Design, and Construction at Michigan State University. We deal with a lot of issues around the built environment, construction management, interior design, landscape architecture, urban and regional planning. We have a raft of undergraduate, graduate, and PhD degrees, and we are committed to making cities safer and better places to live. And so naturally, as a school, we're very concerned about what autonomous vehicles can bring and also how we can mitigate some of the likely problems. So you have my contact information there. We have a research group in the school, Autonomous Futures. It's a group of faculty who are looking at the implications of AVs, the implications of artificial intelligence, and different ways that technology will affect cities and how we can make the best of those possibilities. Thank you very much for your attention today.
Well, thank you very much, Mark. I have to say that I did catch your dad humor and very much appreciated it. So you've got at least one person to clean along. So let's start in with the Q&A. So first one is discuss liability issues and who is responsible for accidents.
Liability is a huge issue, and I think it's one of the forgotten aspects, because if the insurance industry does not go and support autonomous vehicles, then nothing's going to happen. Now, on one side, liability might be improved because there are going to be fewer accidents and there will be tracking of what every vehicle does. And so it might make it easier. But what happens if people take control of the wheel? And what if you like to be autonomous during the week, but you really want to drive a regular vehicle on the weekend? It could well mean that your regular vehicle has much higher insurance costs than the past, while autonomous vehicles may be lower. The trouble is, we don't have a lot of data on what autonomous vehicles will do. Usually when an accident happens, it makes the headlines. And yet a regular accident, sadly, doesn't make the front page of every newspaper, but a Tesla doing something wrong will. And so our ability to assess exactly how safe in what circumstances is still under review. And I think that until the insurance industry provides models that we can rely on, then it's going to be very hard to implement.
Okay. Next question. Actually, this is a kind of a 2-for-1. Mm-hmm. So the first part is, what type of infrastructure technology is necessary for these vehicles to function? And then for this technology, who's implementing it?
I think that a lot of signaling technology is useful. Having measures of conditions on roads is helpful. MSU has laid out a 5G network along one of its main streets as a way of testing these. But I think that this is where we get to the public, the state, often being drawn in to provide it. And so if it benefits everyone, then you can make an argument that it is in fact a public good. It could also be delivered as a private good. But at the moment, we haven't really got enough examples to work with to see what would be fully necessary. Now, a lot of vehicles do connect with each other and tell you, you know, in 50 meters, there is a patch of ice, or in 50 meters, there's a pothole. And that's vehicle to vehicle, which is very, very useful. But on the other hand, if we're needing to collect all this information, will the cell system be enough? If we're generating terabytes from every vehicle, I don't think the cell system as it now stands will be able to handle it. We will need to ramp up our communications infrastructure considerably. As to who pays, it's a great question, but I can't really give you an answer.
Okay, a couple questions related to the, let's see, for autonomous vehicles and standard vehicles,
Yep.
Can they be on the road at the same time?
And this is one of the myths that we notice, and scholars do this as well. A lot of the urban planning literature does. There are two states of the world. Today, where everything is a traditional vehicle, and the future, where everything is autonomous. And the trouble is there is going to be 40 years of very messy changeover. And in that messy period, we're going to have to somehow come to terms. So what happens if you bully an autonomous vehicle? You know that it will stop if there is something in front of it. So what if you're crossing the road and you step out at regular periods to taunt the vehicle? Driving in Michigan is a delight. Everyone is so nice. They let you in when you're at a yield sign. But what if you don't let an autonomous vehicle in at a yield sign? If it's autonomous to autonomous, they will talk to each other. But if it's a regular vehicle and an autonomous vehicle, you may well say, no way am I letting this car in, and you drive by and the vehicle can't move. So I think this mess of the 40-year transition is incredibly understudied.
Well, and that actually spurred several things. So the Hagedorn Grand River intersection, somebody commented like, how is a pedestrian even supposed to navigate that?
That's a very good point. And it could well be that we either put in tunnels or bridges, or we stop everything at a regular period to allow that to take place.
And then, since we're in the fall season, how do you anticipate football game traffic and tailgating working?
Well, that's it. One of the things that's difficult to assess is the affection people have for their automobile. Now, this is declining. And so the current young generation is far less interested in cars and driving than, say, someone my age. I actually like driving. And, you know, a stick shift in the right situation is a great way to spend an afternoon. But I don't want to do that every day. So I think that we'll have lots of different variations. But everything coming into campus, it could be more orderly, or it could be more chaotic. And if you've seen the design of autonomous vehicles, they don't have tailgates. And so you essentially will have to bring your tent and your table with you, because there's no folding down the back of the SUV and laying out breakfast.
You mentioned just a little bit ago, you anticipate about 40 years of this multi-type vehicles on the road. But what's your estimate for the year when AVs kind of become the majority?
I think it's slowed down a little, because we were seeing estimates of the first introduction in 2021-22, and then in the 2030s starting to see a lot of them. I'm really not sure now on what COVID will mean, because one of the great appeals of autonomous vehicles is you don't have to drive. And if you are living in a major metropolitan area, if you're in Chicago or Philadelphia or Los Angeles, and you are stuck with an hour commute each way, you may love the idea of an AV. But if you're now working from home, your desire to get it or use an AV may be much more reduced simply because you're not commuting. And the demand for AV use is going to be from home to Maya, not from here to Ann Arbor for a meeting on a regular basis if you're a commuter. So I think it will depend on what COVID-19 does. There's a lot of dust being kicked up that will change how we live. And until that settles down, until we find out what's happening to retailing and the location of work, it's going to be hard to determine what happens to automobiles. I think one really interesting new advertisement that's out is pivoting, and it's talking about the automobile like it's a smartphone. And there's a group that are in fact commenting, is it a Buick? No, it's an Alexa. Because the vehicle of the future is in fact going to be a container for apps, much like your phone. And in buying mobility, there will be money made from all of the services you can avail yourself in the vehicle. And so now we're seeing the vehicle being promoted to us as essentially a giant mobile smartphone, rather than necessarily the super safe autonomous vehicle.
Let's see, good question. And I actually had this too. So do the auto manufacturers, are they working on a new concept for what these vehicles are going to look like? Because right now we're just retrofitting and it looks, I mean, you're hard pressed to tell the difference. So what do these new vehicles conceptually look like? And then a similar, a related question, are the luxury brands perhaps the first to be developing these?
That's some interesting questions. Clearly, when you look at like Waymo and Google, and they have the bubble-shaped vehicles, they're clearly one form of looking at the vehicle. But I think what will be interesting, it depends on the regulatory environment. At the moment, vehicles need things like rear view mirrors and side mirrors. An autonomous vehicle doesn't, but an autonomous vehicle has to have them if it's on the road. So I think that one of the problems through this transition period is there will be interests that want to get rid of the perhaps superfluous bits and pieces of vehicles that a human driver needs, and replace them with different technologies that apply to an autonomous vehicle. So the trouble with design is you have to design now for both. When we get to the future, I think they could be changed quite a lot. The second question about luxury vehicles, I think, is interesting because, yes, luxury vehicles are offering a lot, and Tesla is the one that is the go-to, often mentioned in terms of offering a huge raft of advanced features on their vehicles. The thing is, if we have a ride-sharing, ride-hailing model of autonomous vehicles, the joy and status of having a prestigious mark might disappear, because you just get into whatever vehicle turns up and move away in it. So I think, yes, it's going to be a high-end piece of technology, but even lower-end vehicles are now getting new technology. I live this every time I rent a car at an airport. I have to sit there and try and work out exactly how to get it going. It's really embarrassing to have to ask the attendant, how do you turn a vehicle on? My vehicle's 10 years old. I need a key. I have to turn the key. I don't need to have a fob within 10 feet and push a button. And so I'm constantly trying to work out what's happening in these new vehicles. So I think that people will come to them from very different backgrounds and have very different experiences. So certainly the resources and the status might be there with a premium vehicle, but do you care what vehicle picks you up and drops you off if you're using a ride-sharing AV in the future?
And on the topic of ride sharing, for almost everybody who has experienced using Uber or public transportation and view it as like, well, oh my gosh, you know, gross and disgusting. Do I have to get in where somebody else was just eating something or smoking or something like that? That's a legitimate question. This person does. Do we run the risk of that?
Certainly, and companies will have to think of ways of reassuring people. Do you have systems that disinfect, again, with a COVID mindset? Do you have sprays that fog the inside of the vehicle after someone gets out? How do you keep them clean? How do you know when they need cleaning? So these are all part of the innovations that have to come before the autonomous AV ride-hailing system takes place.
So can you talk about MSU's program that works on the actual AV vehicles themselves?
I'm not the person. There is a huge division over in engineering. There's the Canvas project. Our socio-mobility contact is Pete Savalainen in engineering. There are a lot of people that are working on things like making sensors more responsive, making vehicles safer, designing interiors that are safe. So there are a lot of people that are doing it, and I would suggest Pete Savalainen, who is one of the co-conveners of the socio-mobility group, would be the person to follow up with in engineering, because he can direct you to the folks working on that, whereas I'm in the social sciences and we're looking at things like the urban planning and the sociological implications of AVs.
Okay. And would you also, similarly, so what's being learned about the AV lawnmowers on campus? Or what are we learning from them?
They are particularly interesting. That is Snowbot. And Snowbot was brought to campus and is used both as a teaching tool and as a snow clearance device. However, for a variety of reasons, it can only be done on fully closed parking lots between midnight and 5 a.m. because there are concerns about liability. We have the Snowbot was the original format, but they discovered that Mowbot, the attachment that mowed lawns, was much more appealing. But when we had a demonstration for our school open house, it took half a dozen people from the landscape unit with a lot of barricades put around a piece of lawn, and we got to see it work. But I understand that MSU is also looking at other type of autonomous grounds care technology. But the important thing is that when MSU does meet these vendors, it's not that they simply want to use the technology. They want to learn from it. They want to have input. And some of the vendors are very pleased because MSU is providing input on how they're working. So when MSU does this, it's not simply to get the lawns mowed. It's to also use it as a teaching opportunity as well.
And I'll put a plug in for a previous Coffee with the Profs. We actually had Matthew Bailey from IPF speak a couple semesters ago, and he actually did mention some of the autonomous vehicles and their use in landscaping. So go to the live stream archive and you can check that out when you have a chance. So next question. What happens to human sense of navigation if we aren't required to navigate anywhere and practice that skill?
That's a great, there's an old truism. I don't know where I am because I flew there. As the son of a geographer, I love maps and I hate not knowing and not having a map. But I think, and also you do end up in the wrong place sometimes. You end up, trying to cross a road that doesn't exist. I think that's just part of the changes in our society. The more you rely on technology, you lose your ability to implement that skill. And if you rely on sat-nav to take you everywhere you go, you may lose, in fact, a sense of context because geography is often around context. What is next to what else? And simply closing your eyes, letting a vehicle take you somewhere, you may not have a really clear sense about your relationship with space.
Okay. So how will the system be designed to prevent hacking into it?
In social science and criminal justice, there is a group on cybersecurity who is looking into that. So I can't really speak to it, but I can tell you, like many things, MSU has a lot of people working on these topics because it is a compelling issue. We don't want HAL telling us what to do. We don't want someone else hacking in and making vehicles perform in a way that might be dangerous or, in fact, a threat.
In regards to owning autonomous vehicles, are you assuming that no one will own their vehicle at any point in time, or?
It is my fear that people will want to own, because I think many of the benefits of owning an autonomous vehicle come when we start getting our road space back, our parking lots back. It depends on how the vehicle is used. If you use it and it's doing a lot of zero passenger trips, you own it, you get into it, it takes you to work, you get out, you save yourself the drive, but the thing's driving back. Or you've got to find a place to put it. A lot of the efficiencies disappear. I'm sure there will be some who would like to own their own vehicle for cleanliness, safety, for whatever reasons. But you're also going to look at an incredibly expensive piece of technology. And even today, something going wrong on an automobile is never cheap in my experience. Imagine if it's got $100,000 worth of software running inside it and something goes wrong, how is it fixed? So I would hope that we move towards a hailing, sharing model rather than having people own their own.
Okay. How much potential is there in including the road surface itself as part of the design? So this individual's indicated they've seen ideas where roads collect solar power,
Yes,
then convey them to the vehicles.
Yep. There are also models that vibrations on roads can power batteries that you can use to recharge. Again, this isn't my field, so I would defer to someone from engineering, but I do know that there are a lot of people thinking about innovative ways. And I do love the unleashing of creativity around what these vehicles may bring. But at the same time, it does involve costs and risks that we need to take into account.
Okay. Let's get one more question. I'm scrolling through. Can you comment on non-terrestrial AVs, primarily drones?
Drones are good and bad, depending on what they're used for. Drones have revolutionized a lot of safety management, of being able to scan the exterior of a building to look for problems in pipelines, power lines, dams. It is a wonderful technology that can be used to observe what is happening to the built environment. So in our field, we're very happy to use it. If the Red Sea floods, we have a drone up instantly showing us the extent of flooding. You can actually have the drone report directly back to geographic information systems, to ArcGIS. So you can send up a drone, it'll send back data, and you've got an instant map of the flood area. These are incredibly useful for managing disasters, managing cities. But drones, of course, also have a military use, and they do serve as a threat. It's why MSU will not let anyone on campus, and believe me, I've tried, have a drone on campus. If you want a photo of campus, you have to fly it along Grand River, and that is not always allowed either, because East Lansing has rules about drones. So they can be a threat. So in peaceful purposes, of course, I think they're incredibly useful. Delivery of blood, delivery of medicines in countries that have very congested urban areas. They're wonderful, but the military implications are significant, and you can't have one without the other, sadly.
Okay, I lied. One more question. We'll end on a very positive note. Do you feel that the acceptance rates of scooters and rideshare programs are good indicators of how AVs will be accepted?
I think it is good in some ways. It's telling us a lot about, say, the impact on exercise. We discovered in our survey of MSU that ride-hailing and scooters replaced walking. And so we have our students walking less. And it's, for much of the year, it's an awesome campus to walk on, and the exercise is good. So it is taking people away from that. Again, this is all balance, because on the other hand, what about people that may be disabled who don't get to move now, who can move because of this? So like everything, there are going to be a lot of nuances, and nuance is difficult to convey because you have people like me saying on one hand and then on the other hand and then on the third hand, because there are so many different possibilities and potentials. I just want us to capture what is good about them and make sure that the harmful aspects are prevented if we can.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Mark. This has been extremely enlightening and very informative. I do want to remind our viewers that today's presentation will be available in our live stream archive, which is on the MSU Alumni Office website within 1 week. And a final reminder that our next presentation is next Monday, same time. And this will be our last presentation in this fall series. We'll be joined by Dan Hayes, a professor in the Department of Fisheries and Wildlife, and he'll be speaking on the topic of grayling in Michigan, challenges in species reintroduction. If you haven't yet registered, we do have deadline is extended until this Wednesday, and we'll be sending out the Zoom link and password later that day. So again, thank you very much. We hope you enjoyed today's presentation. When you sign off, there will be a short survey that asks you to rate today's presentation. So please tell us what you thought. And thanks so much. Have a great day and go green.
Hello, MSU alumni. The credit union was founded in 1937 by MSU faculty and staff who were looking for an opportunity to be banked after the Depression. Over the last 83 years, the credit union has maintained being a partner with Michigan State University. As we approach serving nearly 300,000 Spartans across the world, we know that the more Spartans who choose to do business with the credit union help us to give even further support to the MSU community. Thank you in advance for the opportunity to serve you as a member of the credit union.